Years passed, and Marcus Thompson's name became synonymous with change. His tireless efforts to reform the police department didn't just stop at new policies or training programs. They sparked a movement that spread far beyond his city. Officers from neighboring towns began visiting to learn about building bridges, eager to replicate its success in their own communities. Community leaders invited Marcus to speak at schools, churches, and town halls, where he shared stories of resilience and unity. Slowly but surely, his vision of a fairer, more compassionate system started taking root. But Marcus wasn't blind to the challenges that remained. Change was never linear. There were setbacks along the way. Some officers resisted the reforms, grumbling about soft policing and claiming the old ways worked just fine. Others paid lip service to the new initiatives, going through the motions without truly embracing the spirit of transformation. And outside the department, skepticism lingered among those who had endured decades of mistreatment. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild, and Marcus knew it would take generations to fully heal the wounds of systemic racism. Despite these obstacles, Marcus refused to give up. He often reminded himself of something his father used to say: "A tree doesn't grow overnight. You plant the seed, water it, protect it, and one day it becomes strong enough to stand on its own." That philosophy guided him as he continued to push for progress, even when the road felt impossibly long. One evening, Marcus attended a community award ceremony honoring individuals who had made significant contributions to social justice. To his surprise, he was presented with an award for his leadership and dedication to reform. As he stepped onto the stage to accept it, the crowd erupted into applause. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude. Then, gripping the microphone tightly, he began to speak. "I didn't do this alone," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This journey belongs to everyone who dared to dream of a better future, everyone who spoke up, showed up, and refused to stay silent. This award isn't mine. It's ours." He paused, scanning the room. Faces young and old, black and white, smiled back at him. Some nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears. "When I was pulled over that night years ago," he continued, "I could have chosen anger. I could have let bitterness consume me. But instead, I chose hope. Hope that we can rise above our differences, that we can confront injustice together, and that we can build a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The audience erupted into cheers again, but Marcus held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "We've come a long way," he admitted, "but there's still work to be done. Racism isn't something we can erase overnight. It's a weed that keeps coming back unless we pull it out at the roots. And pulling those roots takes courage. It takes persistence. It takes all of us." As he left the stage, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. The fight wasn't over, but he could see glimpses of the future he'd always dreamed of. A future where no child grew up fearing the very people sworn to protect them. A future where fairness wasn't the exception, but the rule. Months later, Marcus retired from active duty, passing the torch to a new generation of officers trained under his watchful eye. Among them was Jamal, the young man who had bravely spoken out during one of the building bridges meetings. Now a rookie cop, Jamal approached Marcus on his last day at the precinct, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming proudly. "Detective Thompson," Jamal said, extending a hand. "Thank you for everything. Because of you, I know I can make a difference." Marcus shook his hand firmly, a proud smile spreading across his face. "No, Jamal," he replied. "Because of you. The real change happens when good people step forward and carry the torch." As Marcus walked out of the precinct for the final time, he glanced back at the building that had been both his battleground and his home for so many years. Though he was leaving behind a career, he was stepping into a legacy, one built not on words, but on action. And as he drove away, the sun setting behind him once again, Marcus knew the seeds he planted would continue to grow. shaping a brighter tomorrow for generations to come. The weeks turned into months, and the impact of Marcus's actions began to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the precinct walls. The disciplinary hearing for Officers Grayson and Reynolds concluded with both men receiving formal suspensions and mandatory bias training. While some felt the punishment was too lenient, others saw it as a step toward accountability. What mattered most was that their case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how quickly prejudice could unravel careers and tarnish reputations. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just punishing bad behavior. He wanted to transform the culture that allowed such attitudes to exist in the first place. With support from Captain Harris and key community leaders, he launched an initiative called Building Bridges. The program paired officers with local residents for monthly dialogues, fostering understanding between law enforcement and the people they served. These sessions weren't easy. Emotions often ran high, and trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick. But they were necessary. One evening, during one of these meetings, a young man named Jamal stood up hesitantly. His hands trembled as he gripped the microphone, and his voice wavered as he began to speak. "I've been stopped by cops more times than I can count," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Most of the time, I didn't do anything wrong. But every time, I felt like I wasn't seen as a person. I was just a stereotype." The room fell silent. Many officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged guilty glances. Marcus watched Jamal closely, his heart aching for the pain etched across the young man's face. Finally, an older officer named Detective Ramirez raised his hand and spoke softly. "Jamal, I'm sorry you feel that way. And I'm sorry if anyone in this room has ever made you feel less than human. That's not what we're supposed to stand for." Tears welled up in Jamal's eyes as he nodded slowly. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. For the first time, both sides were listening, not just hearing, but truly understanding each other's perspectives. These conversations planted seeds of change, however small, and Marcus knew that even tiny roots could grow into mighty trees given enough care and patience. Meanwhile, Marcus's efforts gained national attention. News outlets covered his story, highlighting the reforms he spearheaded and the courage it took to confront systemic racism within his own ranks. Social media buzzed with praise, and invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences and seminars across the country. Despite the growing spotlight, Marcus remained humble. "This isn't about me," he told reporters during one interview. "It's about creating a world where no one has to prove their worth because of the color of their skin." Back at the precinct, Marcus continued to lead by example. He mentored younger officers, teaching them the importance of empathy and integrity. He reminded them that being a cop wasn't just about carrying a badge. It was about carrying responsibility. "Every interaction matters," he would say. "Whether it's with a victim, a suspect, or someone who just needs help, how you treat people defines who you are." Still, Marcus couldn't ignore the scars left behind by that fateful night. Though justice had been served in some ways, the memory of those insults lingered, a painful reminder of the work still needed. Systemic racism wasn't something that could be eradicated overnight. It was a deeply entrenched problem requiring constant vigilance. Yet Marcus refused to let cynicism take hold. Instead, he channeled his frustration into action, using his platform to advocate for broader policy changes, including stricter oversight and greater diversity within law enforcement. As the months passed, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in the department's atmosphere. Officers greeted citizens with warmer smiles. Complaints about racial profiling dropped significantly, and perhaps most importantly, people in the community began reaching out, not just to report crimes, but to thank officers for their service. Trust, once shattered, was slowly being pieced back together. One afternoon, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing case files, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Mrs. Jenkins, the community leader who had spoken so passionately during the initial meeting. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you, Detective Thompson, for standing up when it mattered most. Because of you, my grandson dreams of becoming a police officer someday. You've shown him, and all of us, that change is possible." Marcus read the words over and over, feeling a lump rise in his throat. In that moment, he realized the true power of his actions. This wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about inspiring hope. Hope that tomorrow could be better than today. Hope that justice could prevail. And hope that one day, everyone would be judged not. The meeting ended with a heavy silence, but the ripple effects of Marcus's confrontation spread quickly throughout the department. Captain Harris wasted no time addressing the issue. Within hours, both Officer Grayson and Officer Reynolds were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Their names became whispered topics in the hallways, and their colleagues avoided eye contact with them. It was clear that their actions had consequences far beyond what they'd anticipated. For Marcus, however, the fight was only beginning. The next day, he requested another meeting, this time not just with his superiors, but with representatives from the city's Civil Rights Commission and community leaders. He knew this wasn't just about punishing two officers. It was about exposing the deeper issues within the system. Bias, whether intentional or unconscious, didn't exist in a vacuum. It thrived when left unchecked, festering until it poisoned the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. When the larger group convened, Marcus took center stage. His calm demeanor masked the fire burning inside him. "What happened to me last night isn't rare," he began, his voice steady but powerful. "It happens every day, to people who don't wear badges, to people who don't have a title to protect them. And too often, those people don't get justice." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around the table, faces shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Marcus continued, "I'm not here to ask for special treatment. I'm here to demand accountability for everyone. If we can't trust our officers to treat every citizen with respect, then we failed as a department and as a society." One of the community leaders, an older woman named Mrs. Jenkins, spoke up. Her voice trembled with emotion. "Detective Thompson, thank you for standing up. But how do we stop this from happening again? How do we make sure my grandson doesn't face the same thing when he grows up?" Marcus exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her question. "We start by acknowledging the problem," he said. "We train officers to recognize their biases, not just once during orientation, but regularly. We hold bad actors accountable, publicly and swiftly. And most importantly, we listen to the people we serve. They're the ones who feel the impact of these failures every single day." Captain Harris chimed in, his tone gruff yet sincere. "This department has made mistakes, and we'll own up to them. But change won't happen overnight. It's going to take effort from all of us." Over the following weeks, Marcus became a driving force behind sweeping reforms. He worked closely with the Civil Rights Commission to develop new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. He pushed for body cameras to be mandatory for all officers, ensuring transparency in every interaction. And he organized town hall meetings where citizens could voice their concerns directly to the department's leadership. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some veteran officers grumbled about political correctness and claimed the reforms were unnecessary. But Marcus stood firm, reminding them that policing wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about building trust. "If we want people to see us as protectors instead of oppressors," he told them during one heated discussion, "then we need to earn that trust. Every day. With every action." Slowly but surely, progress began to show. Complaints against officers decreased, and surveys showed improved public perception of the department. Community members started attending neighborhood watch meetings alongside officers, working together to address safety concerns. For the first time in years, there was hope that things could truly improve. But Marcus knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Change was fragile, and old habits died hard. Still, he felt a sense of pride knowing that he had sparked something meaningful, a movement toward fairness, equality, and justice. As he walked out of the precinct late one evening, the sun setting behind him, he couldn't help but smile. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. The next morning, Marcus walked into the precinct with his head held high. The familiar hum of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and murmured conversations filled the air. Officers moved about, some sipping coffee, others reviewing case files. To anyone else, it was just another day at work. But for Marcus, today was different. Word of last night's incident had already spread like wildfire through the department, thanks to a few offhand comments made by the two officers involved. By the time Marcus arrived, everyone seemed to know something had gone down. As he made his way to his desk, colleagues stopped what they were doing to greet him. Some offered knowing nods, while others gave him pats on the back. A few even whispered apologies, though Marcus wasn't sure if they were apologizing for the behavior of their peers or simply expressing sympathy. He appreciated the support, but kept his focus sharp. This wasn't about him alone. It was about accountability. By 9:00 a.m., the meeting room was packed. Captain Harris, a no-nonsense leader with decades of experience, sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed and his expression stern. The two officers, Officer Grayson and Officer Reynolds, sat across from him, their faces pale and drawn. They looked like schoolboys being called to the principal's office, except this wasn't detention. It was their careers on the line. Marcus entered the room last, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. All eyes turned to him as he took a seat beside Captain Harris. For a moment, there was silence, thick and heavy, as everyone waited for someone to speak. Captain Harris broke the tension first. "All right," he said gruffly, leaning forward. "Let's get this over with. Detective Thompson, I understand you requested this meeting. Care to explain why?" Marcus nodded, his demeanor calm but commanding. He began recounting the events of the previous night, laying out every detail with precision. He described how the officers had pulled him over without cause, mocked his appearance, insulted his intelligence, and only realized their mistake when they saw his name on the license. As he spoke, Grayson and Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes glued to the table. When Marcus finished, the room fell silent again. Captain Harris glanced at the two officers, his brow furrowed. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Grayson cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we thought it was a routine stop. We didn't recognize Detective Thompson. It was all just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Captain Harris repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You call racial profiling and verbal abuse a misunderstanding? Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Reynolds tried to defend himself, stammering, "We didn't mean any harm, sir. We've always respected Detective Thompson. Last night, it was a lapse in judgment." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "A lapse in judgment, that's what you're calling it? Because from where I was sitting, it looked like prejudice plain and simple. You judged me based on my race before you even knew my name. If I hadn't been a detective, what would have happened? Would you have arrested me? Or worse?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Everyone in the room knew the implications. Stories of black men being mistreated, or worse, by police officers weren't uncommon. What made this situation unique was that Marcus had the authority and influence to demand answers. Captain Harris sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just about one bad decision," he said, addressing the two officers. "This is about trust, about integrity. People depend on us to protect them, not discriminate against them. When incidents like this happen, it damages the entire department." Grayson and Reynolds exchanged a glance, their guilt evident. They knew they were in trouble, but more importantly, they realized the gravity of their actions. Their misconduct wasn't just personal. It reflected poorly on the badge they wore and the community they served. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to destroy your careers," he said finally. "But I am here to make sure this never happens again." to me or anyone else. You owe it to yourselves, to this department, and to the people you serve to do better." The weight of his words settled over the room. There was no anger in Marcus's voice, just quiet determination. For Grayson and Reynolds, it was a wake-up call. And for everyone else in the room, it was a reminder of the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. The officers were visibly shaken, their earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of fear and embarrassment. The first officer fumbled with Marcus's license, as if unsure whether to return it or hold onto it for dear life. His partner stood frozen, his arms no longer crossed, but hanging awkwardly at his sides. Both men looked like children caught red-handed doing something they knew was wrong. But Marcus wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. He took the license from the trembling hand of the first officer and slipped it back into his wallet without breaking eye contact. "You know," Marcus began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I spent over 15 years in this department. I solved cases that made headlines, put dangerous criminals behind bars, and earned the respect of my colleagues. And yet tonight, you two decided I wasn't worth treating with basic decency." The second officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Detective Thompson, we didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It was just a routine stop. We didn't recognize you." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "A routine stop? Is that what you call it when you insult someone's intelligence, mock their appearance, and assume they don't belong in their own neighborhood? Because if that's your idea of routine, then maybe it's time for a new approach." The first officer tried to interject, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Sir, please, it was all just a misunderstanding. We had no idea who you were, if we'd known." "If you'd known," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut through steel. "That's exactly the problem. You treated me like I was less than human because of how I look, not because of who I am. What does that say about you? About the way you do your job?" Neither officer had an answer. They shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing against the pavement as if trying to find solid ground in quicksand. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road, highlighting the tension in the air. Cars passed by occasionally, their drivers unaware of the drama unfolding between these three men. Finally, the second officer mustered the courage to speak again. "We're sorry, Detective. Truly, it won't happen again." His voice was soft, almost pleading, as though he hoped Marcus would take pity on them. But Marcus wasn't interested in empty apologies. He leaned back in his seat, folding his hands neatly on the steering wheel. "Sorry isn't enough," he said firmly. "Sorry doesn't erase the fact that you judged me before you even spoke to me. Sorry doesn't change the way people like me are treated every single day. And sorry certainly doesn't fix the damage you've already done." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces pale with guilt. They knew Marcus was right, and there was no escaping the truth of his words. For once, they weren't the ones holding the power. Marcus had turned the tables, forcing them to confront their own biases and actions. "I'll tell you what," Marcus continued after a pause, his voice softer now but still commanding. "Tomorrow morning, I expect to see both of you at the precinct. We're going to have a conversation about this, not just with me, but with your supervisor. Maybe then you'll understand why what you did tonight is unacceptable." The officers nodded vigorously, too stunned to argue. They knew they had no choice but to comply. As Marcus rolled up his window and started his car, he could feel their eyes on him, watching as he drove away. He didn't need to look back to know they were standing there, dumbfounded and humiliated. For Marcus, this wasn't just about teaching these two men a lesson. It was about making a statement, a reminder that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background. And as he merged onto the highway, heading home after a long and exhausting night, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. Justice might not always be swift, but tonight, it had taken one step closer to being served. As the insults continued to rain down, Marcus felt a storm brewing inside him. Each word they threw at him, asterisk stupid asterisk, asterisk boy asterisk, asterisk fancy suit asterisk, was like a pebble hitting a glass window, chipping away at his patience. But Marcus had spent years mastering the art of self-control, and tonight was no exception. He reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he chose to let their behavior speak for itself. Every cruel remark, every condescending glance, was building a case against them, one they would soon regret. The first officer finally stopped pacing and leaned back toward the driver's side window, holding Marcus's license in one hand. His partner stood nearby, arms crossed, still sneering as if this whole situation amused him. "All right, Mr. Big Shot," the first officer said mockingly, flipping the license over in his fingers. "Let's see who you really are." Marcus didn't respond. He simply waited, his dark eyes steady and unwavering, watching the man examine the small plastic card. It only took a few seconds for the officer's expression to change. At first, it was confusion, a furrowed brow, a slight tilt of the head. Then came recognition, followed quickly by panic. The name on the license wasn't just any name. It belonged to Detective Marcus Thompson, a legend within the department, a man whose cases made headlines and whose reputation commanded respect. For a moment, the officer froze, his mouth slightly open as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His partner noticed the shift immediately and stepped closer, trying to get a look at the license himself. When he saw the name, his smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Both men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado crumbling like sandcastles under crashing waves. Marcus could see the gears turning in their heads, the realization dawning on them that they had made a catastrophic mistake. They had treated a fellow officer, and not just any officer, but one of the most respected detectives in the city, with utter disrespect. And worse, they had done so because of the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't say a word. He let the silence stretch out, heavy and suffocating, as the officers struggled to process what they'd done. Finally, the first officer cleared his throat awkwardly and handed the license back through the window. Detective Thompson," he stammered, his voice noticeably softer now. "We didn't realize it was you." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable. "Didn't realize." He repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "You mean you didn't bother to check before calling me names?" The second officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Look, sir," he began, his tone pleading now. "It was just a misunderstanding. We thought maybe you were someone else." "A misunderstanding," Marcus replied, his voice calm but laced with quiet authority. "So, according to you, anyone who drives a nice car and wears a suit deserves to be insulted until proven otherwise." The two officers looked at each other, clearly flustered. Neither of them had an answer. They had been caught red-handed, their biases exposed for what they truly were. And now, standing in front of the very person they had disrespected, they had no idea how to fix the mess they'd created. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the steering wheel. "Here's the thing," he said, his voice firm but measured. "If I hadn't been me, if I had been just another citizen, you would have gone through with this stop exactly the same way. You wouldn't have cared about my rights or my dignity. And that's a problem." The officers said nothing, their faces pale. They knew they were in trouble, and there was no way out of it. For Marcus, this was both satisfying and infuriating. Satisfying because justice was beginning to take shape right before his eyes. Infuriating because this kind of prejudice wasn't rare, it was systemic. And tonight, he had become its latest victim. But Marcus wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message, a reminder that everyone deserved respect, regardless of the color of their skin or the clothes they wore. And as he sat there, watching the officers squirm, He decided that this lesson would stick with them long after the traffic stop ended. The tension in the air thickened as the two officers stood beside Marcus's car, their attitudes growing more hostile with each passing second. The first officer, a tall man with a stern face, leaned closer to the window, his flashlight beam bouncing off the dashboard and into Marcus's eyes. "License and registration," he demanded sharply, his tone leaving no room for questions. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. He grabbed his license and handed it over without a word, knowing better than to provoke someone already on edge. But the second officer, shorter but equally aggressive, wasn't satisfied. Instead of taking the documents, he crossed his arms and sneered. "You got something to say, smart guy." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the accusation. "No, sir," he replied calmly. "I'm just following your instructions." But his politeness only seemed to irritate them further. The first officer snatched the license from Marcus's hand and held it up to the light, squinting at it like it was some kind of forgery. Meanwhile, the second officer began circling the car, peering through the windows and inspecting every detail. His gaze lingered on Marcus's neatly pressed suit and polished leather shoes, which looked out of place in the modest sit-in. "What's a guy like you doing in a neighborhood like this?" the second officer asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This your car, or did you borrow it from somebody important?" Marcus clenched his jaw, but forced himself to stay calm. He knew exactly what was happening here. These men weren't interested in broken taillights or traffic violations. They were profiling him based on the color of his skin. It was infuriating, but Marcus also knew that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. So he kept his tone even and replied, "It's my car, officer, and I live nearby." The first officer scoffed, shaking his head as if Marcus had just told a bad joke. "Yeah, right. A fancy suit, shiny shoes. You sure you're not trying to impress anyone tonight?" Before Marcus could respond, the second officer chimed in again, louder this time. "Maybe he thinks he's too good for us, huh? Too smart to answer our questions." He emphasized the word *smart* mockingly, letting it hang in the air like an insult. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin, but he refused to let them see it. He took a deep breath and said, "Officers, I'm cooperating fully. If there's an issue with my car, I'd be happy to address it. But I need to know what I'm being accused of." His words seemed to enrage them even more. The first officer slammed his palm against the roof of the car, making Marcus flinch despite his best efforts to remain composed. "Don't get cute with me," he snapped. "You think you're smarter than everyone else. Huh? Is that it?" The second officer laughed cruelly, adding fuel to the fire. "Yeah, probably thinks he's untouchable. Stupid if you ask me." That word, *stupid*, hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just angry now, he was hurt. Not because of the insult itself, but because it came from people who were supposed to protect and serve. People who were supposed to uphold justice, not tear it down. For a brief moment, he considered showing them his badge right then and there, putting an end to their behavior instantly. But something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the desire to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Instead of retaliating, Marcus sat silently, his expression unreadable. He watched as the officers continued to mock him, their insults growing bolder with each passing second. They didn't realize who they were dealing with. And that was exactly what Marcus wanted, because when the truth came out, it would hit them harder than anything he could have said. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and the sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus Thompson sat behind the wheel of his car, humming along to the soft jazz playing on the radio. He had just wrapped up another long day at work, one filled with meetings, paperwork, and solving yet another tricky case that others had deemed unsolvable. Marcus was no ordinary man. He was a decorated detective with over 15 years of service under his belt. His sharp mind and dedication to justice had earned him respect across the city. But tonight, none of that mattered. As Marcus drove down a quiet suburban street, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he frowned, confused. He hadn't been speeding, running stop signs, or breaking any rules. Still, being the law-abiding person he was, Marcus signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and modest homes. It seemed like an unlikely place for trouble, but trouble found him anyway. Two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, their boots clicking against the pavement as they approached Marcus's vehicle. From the moment they appeared, there was something off about their demeanor. They didn't walk with the usual calm authority of seasoned cops. Instead, their movements were hurried, almost aggressive. One of them carried a flashlight, shining it directly into Marcus's car before even reaching the window. Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He knew how these situations could go wrong if emotions ran high. Rolling down his window, he greeted the officers politely, his voice steady and respectful. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" The response came quickly but not kindly. One officer leaned toward the window, his posture rigid, his expression hard. Without so much as a glance at Marcus's face, he barked, "Do you know why we pulled you over?" Marcus shook his head slightly, maintaining eye contact. "No, sir. I'm not sure what I did wrong." That's when things started to feel strange. The second officer chimed in, pointing vaguely at the back of Marcus's car. "Your taillight is broken," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. Marcus knew better than anyone that his car was in perfect condition. He'd inspected it just last week during a routine maintenance check. There was no broken taillight. Something else was going on here. The air grew tense as the officers exchanged glances, their body language shifting from professional to confrontational. Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach, but he kept his composure. He could sense where this might be heading, and while it angered him, he refused to let fear or frustration take control. Little did the officers know they were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't soon forget.